So I'd like to hand over now, we all seem to be about here, to Karl Steadman from Just. So Karl, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. Nice to see you again. It's been a while. So yeah, thank you for joining me. Hopefully the technology will work. So I'm going to try and share my screen now to get my slides up. So bear with me, please. And if we go in here, hopefully you can now see my screen. So yeah, my name's Karl Steadman. I'm a retirement and data life specialist here at Just. And as Dan put it so eloquently earlier on, who you're calling vulnerable is what we're going to be talking about today. So vulnerability in the aging brain. Lots have been written about vulnerability, you know, by the regulator, you know, the press, etc., over the last few years, and it is important, you know, making sure we do the right thing by the clients, reputationally for the business as well. But the good news is, you know, most firms say, you know, it is important because it is the right thing for us to do. Size of the issue around vulnerability, probably larger than most people would imagine. Back in 2017, the Financial Lives survey, they're estimating around 50% of UK adults display one or more characteristic of potentially being vulnerable. Now, this doesn't mean that they are actually going to end up in harm's way, either physically, mentally, or financially, but it just goes to show that, you know, it does go a lot deeper than people would have first imagined. So we'll start by going through the presentation. Learning objectives, as always, first of all. So by attending this session, planners will be able to understand how the recent FCA assessment of firms' procedures regarding client vulnerability are being followed. Understand what lessons can be learned to make improvements for financial planning firms. Understand how to identify potentially vulnerable clients. And finally, understand cognitive aging. As I mentioned earlier on, a lot have been written about vulnerability, starting back in 2015 with occasional paper number 8 and the practitioner's pack. Still relevant and lots of good information there. They were demonstrating, you know, examples of where firms have worked well with vulnerability, and also where firms have maybe not done as well as they could have. And we had the guidance consultation last year, but lo and behold, we've had another one this year as well, GC 20/3 that came out in July, guidance for firms on the fair treatment of vulnerable consumers. Again, well worth a read. Chances are probably most of you have vulnerable client policies in place already. But as with anything, it's always good to review to make sure that it is up to date with the latest findings. You know, one of the changes in GC 20/3, they're moving away from the old way of thinking was clients were potentially vulnerable, not vulnerable and vulnerable. But they were concerned that people would be, you know, looking at clients exclusively in those 3 sections, and they're now saying about vulnerability being on a spectrum, because ultimately, you know, anybody can become vulnerable at any stage in life. So that, again, that's well worth a read. And it gives indicators of good and bad examples as well. And also, when we're looking at the regulator, they're saying that they want it to be deeply embedded in this, so top down, and making sure that you know, we're doing the best for the clients when it comes to this important issue. But then, what is vulnerability? There's lots of definitions. The regulator's definition is a vulnerable person is someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to detriment, particularly when the firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. But then they do go on to say something further, because again, unfortunately, we are living through the coronavirus pandemic, And so they're saying we expect that more consumers will be in vulnerable circumstances since the onset of coronavirus, and many of these will be newly vulnerable and or have multiple drivers of vulnerability. So again, it's not just one cause of vulnerability, that it might be multi-layered, and these are people that wouldn't have been vulnerable beforehand. So there's lots to think about with regards to this. But I suppose the word vulnerability is, positive kind of negative connotations around it. So we're seeing firms adopting phrases like ongoing client well-being, things like that. So you may want to consider using kind of terminology, but if you don't mind, I'll carry on using vulnerability because that's how the regulator describes it. But then who is vulnerable? These are the types of people that historically, people you could be describing as old, they're vulnerable. But as we know now, it can happen at any stage, and vulnerability can be permanent. If you have dementia, something like that. It can be sporadic, so drifting in and out of vulnerability, maybe with mental health issues, and it can be temporary, one-off, so maybe a bereavement, divorce, something like that. And the types of vulnerability we have to contend with: people being excluded. Certainly, if you're looking at some larger corporations now, they're trying to push everybody online. So with banks, they're closing down branches. That's their business decision. But actually, for some people, they want to still deal with it face to face. They don't necessarily have broadband or the ability or the inclination to use online banking. And in fact, going back to the same survey I was mentioning earlier on from 2017, they estimate about 38% of adults aged 65 and over have used the internet for online banking and a banking app. So around about 2/3 of people haven't actually used it yet. So again, from a business perspective, if you're looking at changing your processes and procedures, then you may want to consider, if you're pushing clients down one avenue, are you excluding people from that function, shall we say. There's also disengagement. So people get into an age where they don't necessarily want to deal with these sorts of things. It's just saying, well, they set up a third-party mandate, son or daughter, to deal with their banking, things like that, which is fine. But obviously bearing in mind, if they lose capacity, they can no longer use that. So again, it highlights the importance of setting up lasting powers of attorney as early as possible. Very big one, scams. Unfortunately, they still do happen. And again, with the regulator, if you saw the Dear CEO letter that came out in January this year, that's a focus that they're going to be looking at over the next couple of years, certainly with pension and investment scams. And even the press are picking up on these nowadays. You've got ITV about a week ago. They had a program about scamming the elderly. There was one thing on there, some poor gentleman had been scammed at £330,000. Someone phoned up purporting to be from the bank. Account's been compromised. We're going to move your money to another account with your name on. And unfortunately, it was gone. But it happens to younger people as well. You may remember the article about Helen Skelton about a year ago, the lady from, I think she used to be on Blue Peter, but also Country File. And same thing happened to her. Someone phoned up from the bank. She lost £70,000. She was distracted when the phone call came through. Child was climbing a tree, other one was fighting with a dog, the other dog was trying to eat the birthday cake. And so at that point when she took the call, distracted, and unfortunately that happens. So it's not necessarily somebody being vulnerable, it could be that they're actually in a situation that makes them vulnerable at that point in time. Then moving on, it could be exposure to mis-selling. So people who don't necessarily understand complex financial matters, or if they have mental health issues, things like that. Inappropriate products or services, so being sold something that doesn't actually work for them, and also too much debt. So people looking for that silver bullet to get themselves out of debt, you know, you have these scammers promising, you know, 10% returns if you give us X amount of money, and they get themselves into further problems as well. So that's some of the ones. Obviously, it's not exhaustive, but these are some things we need to be aware of. And if we're looking at COVID in particular, so if you've got your vulnerable client policy in place, fantastic. But over the last 6 months, you know, have there been any changes to it? What are we doing differently because of the situation we're in? So again, these are some things that we've come up with. You may have already be doing these, which are great, but there could be some things that you may want to look at. So mental health is a big issue at the moment, and people feeling excluded, disengaged, not seeing friends, family, even colleagues, you know, people living on their own. You know, a big part of their life and social life was their colleagues. If you're looking at your existing client base, have you identified people that are vulnerable? How are you helping them through this? Making sure you're keeping in contact. Liaising with other family members. So again, if you've got powers of attorney in place, family members do the attorney, you know, speaking to them, because they may have a different view on how, you know, their mum or dad, your client, is actually coping with it all. Technology. Don't we love technology? Thankfully, you know, we have the technology now that we can do this sort of thing. But again, some people may be a little bit shy of using it. My wife's parents, they're both in their 80s now. Since lockdown, we've managed to get them to do online shopping, which is fantastic, because it's taken us a long time to get them to do that. But because they're shielding, because various health conditions, they've not been able to see the grandkids. So we've actually got them up and running on WhatsApp video calls. So just because they're old and they've not used technology before, we can start introducing it to them, and, you know, just phoning people as well. But really, it's just protecting people from scams at the moment. Figures I last saw, which was up until I think July or August, they were saying around £5 million has been lost to COVID scams, which is a frightening amount of money. These are things such as fraudulent track and trace things where there's malware in there, people phoning up, trying to claim 50, you know, get them to pay £50 for a COVID test and various other things. So if you have newsletters that go out to the clients, you know, monthly, quarterly, etc. Again, if you don't already, maybe having a scam smart section, updating people with any scams that you hear of. You know, there's a big one last year about HMRC phoning up, recorded call. This is HMRC. There's an issue with your tax return. Please press 1 to speak to an advisor. If you don't press 1, there's an issue being a warrant being issued for your arrest. I'm assuming they just try and take your bank details. It would be a very expensive telephone call to have. So it's just highlighting these sorts of things to make sure that your clients are aware. Because again, as I said, this is an area that the FCA are looking at very closely. You've probably seen the jet ski advert that's been on TV recently. So it's just, you know, making sure that clients are aware of things that are going around, so they don't become, I suppose, a victim of these scams. So we go back to these people, and actually these two ladies, which I didn't mention earlier on, it's actually mother and daughter. So we've got Teresa, aged 77, and Lorraine, aged 88. Who's vulnerable out of these two? Well, we could make an assumption, but you know what they say about making assumptions, so we're probably best not to do that. We need to look a little bit deeper. So what have we got? Teresa, as we know, unfortunately has dementia, and it's been getting worse recently. So the potential is there for low literacy, numeracy, and financial capabilities gradually declined. She could be seen as old, and she has dementia, as I mentioned. But then we have Lorraine. She's now got caring responsibilities, which can be quite stressful. Potential low income and or indebtedness, and changing circumstances as well. So again, potentially who's vulnerable? We could say, well, Lorraine, could be Teresa, could be both. But again, we need to dig that a little bit deeper as well. And if we do, we find that actually poor old Lorraine's been sleeping on her mum's couch for the last 4 or 5 weeks because mum has a habit of wandering now. So she's had to make that difficult decision to put mum into long-term care. And that's obviously a difficult thing to do on its own. But now mum's in a Care Quality Commission care home, which is good, so she's being looked after. So we could actually say, well, potentially neither are vulnerable because Teresa's in a care home, so that's taking the pressure off of Lorraine. But we dig a bit deeper still. We're saying, well, Lorraine's having to deal with the guilt of putting poor mum into the care home. She's got a full-time job. She's got 2 grown-up children still living at home. She's having to sell the house, and she's having to contend with the local authority to see if there's any financial assistance or help for her mum. So we're kind of going, well, actually, it's probably Lorraine. She's in a point where she could be deemed as vulnerable because of all the extra stress and strain that she's having to contend with. So if you overlay that in a business sense, if Lorraine is your client, and you're dealing with her, do you know what's happening to her mum? Do you know what's happening in a sort of broader life, so to speak? As I say, the good thing is Lorraine had a power of attorney in place for her mum, so that's great. She was able to contend with all of that. And I suppose, again, it shows the importance of getting a power of attorney in place early, because I suppose with a power of attorney, you can then start to have, planning for succession, intergenerational planning. So if the power of attorney for Lorraine, the attorneys may be her children, get them involved, try to foster a relationship with them. There was a report out from the USA about 2 years ago. Now, I've not been able to see or find a UK equivalent, and they're estimating about 60 to 70% of children no longer use their parents' financial advisor once they take control of their parents' assets. And that could be by death or, power of attorney. So if you start to foster that relationship, hopefully that won't happen. You can, I suppose, with your client's consent, bring them into a meeting. So you can kind of demonstrate what you're trying to achieve for their mum. Some firms have gone even further, and they've said, well, actually, now you're an attorney for my client, we can give you an hour and a half of our time for a free financial review. And there may be nothing that you can do at this point in time, but you're starting to build that relationship. So when they get to a point that they are looking at maybe buying a house, pension, things like that, hopefully they'll come to you. And again, dealing with Lorraine, if you're setting up a power of attorney, ask the question, are you a power of attorney for anybody else? And that's a kind of a gateway to saying, okay, it's your mum, dad, maybe an older uncle, auntie. Is there anything we can do for them? So that could be tax planning, how they're dealing with income in retirement. It's a requirement for maybe lifetime mortgage, and also long-term care as well. So that one conversation around power of attorney, you're fishing upstream and downstream. So it's making it a truly intergenerational piece of advice. So what do we do when we maybe recognise that somebody is potentially vulnerable? So we've recognised it. We then need to record it as per your vulnerable client policy. Obviously GDPR, we need to make sure it's not too much information, but enough so we understand what the requirements are, and then respond to that, which may be adding an additional process to the advice, maybe doing a 3-stage process rather than a 2-stage process, and also signposting as well to maybe external resources, which we'll go through in a little while later. But really, there's 4 key areas that we need to consider when we're talking about vulnerability. That's health, it's resilience, and that could be financial resilience as well as mental resilience, life events, life happens, as they say, and finally capability as well. But we'll start to look at health first of all. So, that could be someone's ability to do day-to-day tasks. So is it mobility, hearing, visual problems, mental health, cognitive impairment? They're getting older and they're just naturally starting to slow down. Again, with COVID, if they've been isolating or that they're not seeing as many people as they used to, what are the effects of isolation? Are they making rash or illogical decisions along the way? Then we move on to life events. Caring responsibilities, as we saw with Lorraine, it can bring additional stress. Again, with my wife and her sister, have caring responsibilities for their parents as well. It can be bereavement, how they're having to contend with that, because again, if you've got somebody passes away, the partner that passed away could have been dealing with all of the paying the bills, things like that. So the person that's left never set up a direct debit, never paid the bills before, having to contend with that as well as the death of their partner. Income shock, either reducing or perhaps they've come into a large amount of money via an inheritance. That can have its own inherent problems as well. Breakdowns of relationships. Unfortunately, the over 65s in the UK is the largest cohort of people getting divorced currently, so having to contend with that. And just having non-standard requirements. So, a lot of things in financial services are built around for what might be seen as the average client. I've never met an average client, and I'm sure you've probably not got one on your books either. So it's, it's just making sure we're adapting to those requirements. And also, power of attorney as well, having to contend with that. Then we look at resilience. So again, can be erratic income, low emotional resilience, lack of a support structure. And again, if we look at this in the kind of COVID-19 era, so it's the ability to bounce back, having been alone for such a long time, it can affect your mental health. So it's social isolation, additional support maybe needed. So I mentioned earlier on signposting. I think this is a really important part of a vulnerable client policy. Be unrealistic for us to think that we can help clients with every aspect of vulnerability. So there's lots of specialists out there that can help. So that might be local social services, healthcare providers, later life solicitors, and also local and national charities as well. So, with us at Just, we support dementia friends. I'm a dementia friend. You can become a dementia friend, or indeed go one stage further and become a dementia champion. If you go onto their website, you can do some online training. They'll send you a pack with a nice little badge, and you can wear that to your client meetings, etc. And it can, maybe start up a conversation around kind of these later life things. Obviously, there are other charities out there as well. It's just one that we support, Age UK, Alzheimer's Society, etc. as well. So I think these are really, really important parts of the vulnerable client policy. Also, unfortunately, we've got furloughing and redundancy, and so maybe people are now starting to tap into their pensions a little bit earlier than they thought they were going to. So again, the sustainability of income, it's the resilience of that income as well. So lots and lots to think about with regards to that. Then we go on to capability. So that could be low knowledge or confidence. Literacy and numerical skills could be fairly low. English could be a second language. We've mentioned poor digital skills, but I got the grandkids to help on there. And again, it can be conflicting commentaries and opinions. So reading one thing, but reading something else. The financial and emotional aspects of vulnerability kind of can hit on the capability as well. And from an advisor's perspective, I suppose it's really kind of helping your clients to look at things in a logical and objective way, because again, it could be a point that they're now actually overthinking things because they've not got a sounding board to kind of talk about these things. And another issue that we have to contend with and look at as well is behavioural bias. So again, this is from the regulator, how people present information. So firms should also consider how vulnerable consumers process that information as well, and including considering the effects of potential behavioural bias. So how we frame a certain situation or product can have a negative or positive outcome with regards to the client, and also giving additional time where appropriate. So again, not allowing customers to feel under pressure to agree to something quickly, allowing them extra time to work through this process. Now, pretty good news when it comes to getting older. Functional numeracy and awareness of key financial terms and concepts reaches its peak at retirement age. So we've all got something to look forward to there. So really what that means is we have a good ability of learning new knowledge, retaining that information and the concepts, etc. So, you know, that's good. But then it steeply declines aged around 75. So again, with more people staying invested in the markets for longer nowadays, we have to build in processes and procedures, because if we get to a point where there is a cognitive decline in their abilities, we need to factor that in as well. So if we're looking at the aging brain and cognitive aging, and really I suppose there's a couple of stages here we want to talk about. Cognitive aging is, I suppose it's that annoying but unfortunately true thing that as we age, we tend to slow down. Anybody that does sport, if you're a runner or something, you know that at the age you are now, certainly at my age, I'm not as quick as I was 20 odd years ago, and you just got to accept it. But the brain starts to slow down as well. So we have, you know, the issues of walking into a room, forgetting why we went in there, the tip of the tongue moment, you can't think of the word that you're trying to say. And it's important to understand how aging changes cognition. And again, it helps you understand and anticipate when dealing with clients in later life, and better understand the changes you may notice in that older person. And whether these are out of the ordinary as opposed to just the normal cognitive aging. Because it could be we're having to deal with mild cognitive impairment. And so I suppose with that, that is memory, thinking skills, not as bad enough to qualify as dementia, but a person is worse than expected for their age and educational level. So cognitive aging, it's just a little bit slowing down, but mild cognitive impairment is one stage further on. But with both of these, they should be able to manage, you know, their daily life tasks. And then obviously we've got to contend with dementia as well. As you're aware, you know, dementia is an umbrella term for a range of progressive conditions that affect the brain. I think there's actually over 200 subtypes of dementia. I suppose we have Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, Lewy bodies, frontal temporal dementia, and I think mixed dementia as well. Some of them sort of main ones. And with Dementia UK, they're estimating around 850,000 people currently living with dementia in the UK, and they're estimating it's set to rise to over 1 million by the end of 2021. So again, it kind of highlights the importance of having these things in place, and again, lasting powers of attorney to make sure that we can still deal with the clients if any of this happens. Because if we don't have a lasting power of attorney in place, as I'm sure you're aware, have to go through court of protection, can cost a lot more money. When I was speaking with a later life solicitor, actually at CISI event earlier on this year, when we were doing face-to-face, she was telling me it was around 6 to 9 months to get something through court protection. And, you know, it makes a stressful period of time for your client's family a lot more stressful because of that. And I suppose other ways that it can affect people's memory and thinking as they get older. So it's processing speed, attention, and memory. So if we're talking about processing speed, how quick the brain can process information. It's the mental tasks, taking in information, formulating an appropriate response. You know, some older adults may struggle with complex tasks that require a lot of quick information processing. Then we've got attention. So it's the ability to concentrate on and focus on something specific, so the related information can be processed. As people get older, they may not be able to have the same attention span, so they're distracted by noise or visual clutter. So I suppose now, you know, if we're in the good old days of home visits, they're in a nice, comfortable surrounding. If they're having to travel, maybe, you know, some friends of mine who are financial advisors, they've been meeting in coffee shops, things like that. But there's lots of noise, lots of things going on around. It's distracting, and for somebody who's maybe older, it may be too much, and they're not focusing on what you may be saying. And we have memory as well. So normal older adults generally good at retaining information and memories, certainly long-term memories that they previously acquired, but it may take longer for them to retrieve them. But again, it may lead on to the processing speed as well. So it's having difficulty solving those complex problems and weighing up those complicated decisions. And it may mean that they actually have more forgetfulness around recent events as well. Other ways that it may affect your clients: language skills, executive functioning, and emotional process. So what do we mean by those? Well, it's understanding and producing both verbal language and written language. So again, with normal aging, they retain their vocabulary and ability to comprehend written language, but they may struggle with understanding rapid speech or distorted speech. So again, if you're doing Zoom calls, things like that, you may need to slow down a little bit just to make sure that the words are getting through okay. When we talk about executive functioning, this refers again to mental skills that are needed for activities relating to planning, organisation, problem solving, mental flexibility, and appropriate behaviour. So again, it's kind of making those complex decisions, organising information and planning activities, things like that. And then we have the emotional processing. So for clients that are getting older, they may start to develop more of a positive bias. So what we mean by that is they tend to pay more attention to situations that are emotionally positive. They may try and avoid or deny issues that they find unpleasant. So again, when we're talking about powers of attorney, wills, long-term care, if we start that conversation earlier on, when they're younger, you may get a better response from them, and it's all kind of in place. When they do get older, we don't have to necessarily contend with that. So lots of things to think about there, but again, I suppose it's supporting them. How do we get them to a point where we can help them? Well, as I've mentioned before, it's allowing more time to think. So that two-stage process may be a three-stage process. Writing down key points, leaving it with them so they can mull things over. You know, obviously they can give you a call back if they have any questions or queries. Avoiding those noisy, busy environments so they're not distracted, so they can focus on the conversation that you're having with them. Early appointments, so they're less tired. But again, it could be they're taking tablets in the morning, they look drowsy, but they're better in the afternoon. So it's finding out what's best for your clients. We mentioned estate planning before, so get the powers of attorney in place, talking about care, things like that, so they're aware of the conversations that you'll be having as they age. And the potential is simplifying their finances. If they get to a point, they may want to simplify, obviously bearing in mind the right advice is the right advice, and another consideration that they may want to look at. And again, you know, the things that we can do, internal training programs, things like this, which is great. Staff to share knowledge and experiences, things that they've had to contend with when dealing with maybe their mother or father, companies that have done things well and maybe not so well, having specially trained staff, implementing vulnerability champions. We have these at Just. Engaging with external organisations and third-party support providers. Again, we've gone through those, being later life solicitors, charities, etc. Having specialist guides, you can write them yourself, but in all honesty, there's a lot out there that you can use. We have a lot on our justadvisor.com website. Dementia Friends, Alzheimer's, Age UK, etc. have a lot of really good documentation on their websites as well. And training programs also. And again, this is something we can help you with. So the practical actions from yourself as well. So looking and reviewing all your key documents, making sure that they reflect, or the vulnerable client policy reflects on the key documents, and your web pages, making sure they're easily accessible, easily readable, etc. So maybe with your key documents, are they available in large font, maybe audio files, things like that. We mentioned charities and other organisations, allowing staff to take sufficient time to explain details clearly, continually checking consumer understanding, and again offering that range of channels. So we mentioned excluding people earlier on, so it could be face-to-face, Zoom calls, telephone, email, sending out on paper. So again, letting the client choose rather than trying to funnel them down something that suits the firm rather than the client. And as with anything, we need to continually maintain or monitor and evaluate your policy, make sure it's still up to date. So monitoring, testing experiences of vulnerable consumers, what worked well, what we could have done better, having that quality assurance process in place that identifies areas that need requirement. We're lucky now, we can get our hands on lots of MI, so analysing the data, drawing information from that, learning from that, and then developing, and then going through and continually updating and monitoring to make sure that you do have that good process for all of your clients. Now we come to the end now, so hopefully you'll agree that we've gone through those learning outcomes. I did mention that we do have a lot of information, so we've got technical guides. Dealing with vulnerable consumers is a really good read, about 40 pages, lots of good information on that. We do have an online CBT training module, which we launched about a year ago now in collaboration with Solar. Really, really good. I think pretty much all of us just have gone through it. Takes about an hour, 20 questions at the end. If you pass, you get your certificate. Really, really good. And again, we've had firms where they said, actually, we've had everybody in the firm take it because everybody has contact with clients. So even people that just aren't, that answer the phones, they build relationships with the clients if they notice something different. Remember the 3 R's, so recognise, respond, etc. And again, if you're looking at building professional connections, go see solicitors, vulnerable client policy in place. All members of staff have gone through this solid training. Works really, really well. So if you're interested in that, come and see us in our room. You've got myself and Joe George will be in our room from 2:30 to 4:30 today, and from 10 till 12 tomorrow. Again, we have a document specifically around coronavirus. We have a client wellbeing checklist. Again, if you're interested in that, let us know. So lots of ways of contacting us through the website, your normal account manager. If you've got your smartphone or your tablet available, if you hover it over this QR code, that will take you directly to our vulnerable client pages on our website. Bit of technology there. So I've pretty much come to the end of my presentation, so thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I hope you've taken some things away from this, and as I say, please do come and see me or Joe in the room afterwards. So I'll hand you back to Dan, and thank you.
Cool, thank you, Carl. We did have 2 quick questions in the chat, which I'll just pose to you whilst you're up here.
Okay.
They kind of link together. So Pippa was asking, well, should we tell clients that they're vulnerable or that we're treating them as potentially vulnerable? Do you have a kind of a view on that?
I suppose, again, if you're kind of framing it around ongoing client well-being, and when you're talking to clients, you highlight that if something happens and you feel this before it actually happens, then clients are aware they won't feel necessarily insulted. With my mother-in-law, if I told her she's potentially vulnerable, she's only about 5'2" now, she'd give me a clip around the ear, and and I'll never be invited around to Sunday lunch again. So there's ways of doing it, but I believe that if you start to talk about vulnerability and how things happen when you age with clients, then there's no surprise when you say, well, actually, we feel that maybe you need a family member here as well. So again, if you've got a power of attorney in place, if you notice something, you can maybe talk to the attorney and they can broach it themselves, which kind of they're third partying that information from yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a wise approach, and no one wants to have the surprise of awkwardness
No.
there. Whereas it's good to build the relationship to say I just got a little bit of concern. I might be wrong. But
Yes.
there's some other conversations going on in the chat around that word. I mean, there's a lot of connotations with the word vulnerable. Oh, you're vulnerable. You're as a sign of weakness. And there's people throwing some other terms in there that might work. Have you got a kind of if the regulator said, Karl, come up with a new word for vulnerable clients that you guys think might be a little bit more sensitive, what would you go for?
I think I mentioned it. I like ongoing client well-being. I think that kind of encapsulates it, and it's not a kind of derogatory term. It's putting the client's well-being at the heart of what you do.
Yeah, I like that. It's a nice round and caring word. Thank you, Karl. Really appreciate your time. It's great seeing you again.
And you,
Hopefully, I actually
Dan.
get to see you in person before too long.